Hello and welcome. I'm Mark from WhiskyBrother, and this is the Whiskey Makes Me Happy Hour. This is our 7th week in a row. It's hard to believe. I think just with SA lockdown and the current craziness of the world, the days are definitely just starting to blur together. Just excuse me if I'm a bit out of sorts. I think I really need to get out the house. Just thank you very much for tuning in again. For another weekly live stream. I'm coming to you live from Johannesburg in South Africa, and it's lovely to see everyone online. Thank you very much again for joining us. It feels like it's, at least if you're watching from South Africa, it's starting to get a little bit cold. More excuse to drink whiskey. I do hope everyone has whiskey at home. I know with the inability to buy more whiskey over the last weeks, many of you are probably running low. But hopefully this digital dram is at least a small fix while we desperately wait to be able to get back up and running and get whiskey into your glass. I hope wherever you're watching this from, you're safe and sound, keeping well and healthy. Appreciate the interest and appreciate you coming through and allowing us to kind of share a whiskey with you. In my glass today, I have an Evan Williams single barrel. Since our special guest today, is American and is calling in from Pennsylvania, I thought it made sense to make him feel comfortable, make him feel at home, and drink some American whiskey. Let us know what's in your glass. Nice to see everyone in the comments section. Lots of familiar names and a few new ones, so thank you guys. And please let me know what you're drinking, and maybe let Mark, our special guest, that's going to be Mark and Mark today, let Mark know where you're watching from. I'm drinking some single barrels, so Slangevar and Cheers. Just in terms of WhiskyBrother and the South African kind of prohibition at the moment, I think everyone knows, and if you don't, currently waiting for level 3. As per the President's address on Wednesday evening, so that was 2 nights ago, we very much hope that by the end of the month, so from the 1st of June, we'll be able to operate. It will be very limited hours, but we do hope that South African, the lockdown level will be reduced from 4 to 5. From 4 to 3, and at level 3 we can do some restricted retail hours. So when that comes around, we will start getting on all the orders that we have kind of banked up. Thank you for all those who've placed an order with us. At the moment, as you know, we cannot get your whiskey out to you, but as soon as we can, as soon as level 3 comes around, we'll do that. And in terms of getting the shop open, we will communicate all that when it happens. So at least for the next 2 weeks, we're sitting tight. We're desperate to kind of do what we do and do what we love, and get you your whiskey. So just, not that we're the holdup here, but thank you for your patience. In the meantime, thank you for your support. The live streams will keep going as well. We're already looking at guests at this point in time. Who knows how long lockdown in South Africa will last. We can deliberate that, but I'll leave that to the professionals. But as soon as we can, we'll get your whiskey to you. For this week's show, very much just jumping straight into our special guest. There's still, there is some news coming from Scotland and in terms of kind of whiskey releases, but they definitely have dried up a lot. I think a lot of releases have been pushed out, have been delayed. All the whiskey festivals have been cancelled or postponed. That includes ours. Although there's still kind of a trickle of news out there every now and again, I think we'll save that to bank it up, and maybe in a future show where we don't have a special guest, we'll maybe spend slightly longer just talking about those new releases. In the meantime, if you have any questions for either Mark Gillespie, our special guest today, or for myself, or just about whiskey in general, please post them in the question section. If you like someone else's question, just give it the thumbs up, give it the vote, and I'll be sure to try and get to as many questions as I can. So very much jumping then straight into our special guest. Our guest for this afternoon is Mark Gillespie, and when I say afternoon, I very much mean South African time. Mark is based on the east coast of the US, so I believe it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Hopefully it's not too early for him to have a whiskey in his glass, but it may just be. But Mark Gillespie is the founder and the host of WhiskyCast. WhiskyCast is a weekly whiskey podcast. And unbelievably, it has been now going for close to 15 years. I believe the first episode was in November 2005, which to some of us may feel like it's just yesterday, but it is a good 15 years ago. And Mark has consistently produced a weekly podcast. Some weeks he's actually produced more than one, based on if it's a whiskey festival, etc., based on what's happening in the industry, and has been making these available to listeners across the world for the last 15 years. Mark historically was a journalist, and we'll speak to him and get some of the more accurate information than what may just be out there on the web. But from my understanding, spent a good almost 25 years in journalism, TV and radio, found a kind of a passion for whiskey, and decided to bring those two things together. And at least from where I'm sitting, and from I think where a lot of his listeners are sitting, Mark WhiskyCast has been very successful. So I think a very interesting individual to speak to, a wonderful person. I've been fortunate enough to cross paths with him a few times in different parts of the world and different shows, and a podcast that I personally listen to. And if you're not aware of it, I think this is a great opportunity, great time to maybe get to know about Mark, get to know about WhiskyCast, add it to your podcast app, and make it a weekly listening activity. In addition to the podcast, Mark is doing monthly tasting panels. He's doing video content as well when he travels to various shows or various distilleries, various events. I don't think there is a person who maybe travels more broadly for whiskey. And again, so if you're a whiskey rider or you're a brand ambassador, these guys get a lot of mileage, a lot of travel under their belt. Mark is one of them. And so it is our pleasure to get him on the show. Mark and I have been in contact on and off for kind of years, and just thinking of kind of who we'd like to speak to and who we may think South Africans are interested in hearing, and maybe different points of view, people from different countries. Mark was high on my list. So very much inviting Mark up onto the screen to join us, and we'll kick off the conversation. Please, if you have any questions, and I see questions being posted, so thank you already. Hopefully there's something we can answer. The first one, I see something about the pandemic from Gilroy, but we'll get to that. But let's just have Mark join us. I believe he's trying to connect now. So yeah, while Mark is trying to connect to us, let's just see. He is trying to connect. We'll just give him a few minutes. If that doesn't work, we'll drop him another invite. A weekly podcast available on all channels, including the WhiskyCast website. In the top of the comment section, I did post the link, and if you need, I'll post it at the end as well. So if you head over to the website, plenty of news and reviews, all whiskey-based, and very much global. So although Mark is based in America, he travels to Scotland regularly, to Ireland regularly, and so the information he's bringing us as listeners and as whiskey enthusiasts is global. I'm just going to see if he's about to join us. It seems that no matter how many times or how prepared we are, there's always a little bit of a delay. Mark, if you're listening, I'm just going to send an invite again. Sorry, everyone, for watching in. This is the kind of the downside of doing live events. Not that this is like a big, massive live event or anything, but it just feels that no matter how prepared we are or what's happening, there's always a little bit of delay or glitches. Mark.
I keep clicking the link. I don't know if you can hear me, Mark.
So I can hear you. I cannot see you, but good to know that you can hear us.
I keep clicking the link to accept it, and let's see what we can do here. Let's see if I can change my settings a little bit.
Okay. If I can hear you, everyone can hear you. So that's at least that's half of the offering.
That's half the problem here. Just a split second here.
We'd love to get your handsome face up on screen shortly. I may as well, while we wait, I will quickly go through the questions and just see if there's anything I can address now that isn't specifically.
Okay, I'm still here.
Mark? Oh, yes, Mark.
It is not letting me accept the camera for some reason. Just a second here.
All right, no rush. Take your time. I'm going to just look at answering a question or two. So Gilroy has a question that's getting some good votes already. So Gilroy, thank you for your question. The question is, hi all, this pandemic has given us greater access to whiskey people and distillery information we didn't have before. Do you think this will become part of the ongoing engagement between distilleries and consumers? In your opinion, which distillery has done the best? I think that's an excellent question, and I think we've seen an explosion of these live events and online tastings, and I think I've kind of touched on this before, but I think it is excellent. I think, for people who are based maybe in Europe or the UK, it is a lot easier to get to these whiskey shows, get to the distilleries. We're a long way away, here in the kind of southern tip of Africa. Not only is it expensive, but it is, it takes longer to get there, and it's not something you can kind of just jump across to Islay for a weekend. Whereas if you're in mainland Europe, that very much is an option. So I think it's brilliant to have these online events, have more people engage, have more of the master distillers and the whiskey writers, etc. Make the time available. I think going forward, it has to become part of the fabric. I think once it was, for me personally, it was just about adopting this and kind of venturing out and doing it. I think now that all these individuals have done it, it's kind of, well, we know how to do it. We've done it successfully. We know there's a demand, so why would we not keep doing it? Now, I do think there'll be less of them. At the moment, there is a very large amount. There isn't I think if you're online and you're kind of engaging and you're looking, there probably isn't a night that there isn't some activity or online tasting. So I think there's also, at the moment, there's kind of that risk of just, you're inundated with it and a bit of fatigue sets in. But in general, I think it will be part of the landscape going forward. I very much hope it will. And I think people realize that they can touch a new audience, and individuals that love what they do, love their whiskeys, know who they are, but don't have access to be able to get to them. Mark, welcome.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Doing well. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I wound up just switching over the browser and switching to because I'm a Mac person, so I had to switch it from Safari to Chrome. So I think that may have played a role somehow.
All right. So I'll be honest, and I mean, I'd like to be device agnostic, but we seem to always have issues when it comes to Macs and our guests using them.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I find because we're an all Mac family around here, so I don't even have a PC to play with.
That's all right. No, but thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us. I know it's quite early there, your time, 10 a.m., if I'm not mistaken.
Well, normally, as people in my family point out, this is about the time I'd be rolling out of bed most mornings. But I needed to get up today, and I wouldn't have missed this for the world. It's an honor to be on with you guys, and hello to everyone in South Africa and wherever you're watching around the world. I'm glad to be with you this morning.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. So I tried to give you a bit of an introduction there. I probably didn't do a very good job.
Oh, you did a great. You overpuffed it a lot. You sold it hard.
So I think what's ironic about this is that, I mean, you are much more comfortable in front of the camera, than I am. You've been doing this now for not just whiskey, but pre WhiskyCast. This was part of your kind of, almost your. This was part of your skills package.
Well, so I should point out that, and this is going to date me, but this is actually 2020 or 2020 is actually my 40th year in broadcast news.
Wow.
And journalism. I got my first radio job in Indiana in a small town radio station the day I graduated from high school when I was 18 years old.
Wow. Congratulations. I mean, that's an impressive feat to get it right out of being, graduating.
It was a part-time weekend gig and worked in radio all through college, and then moved into television news after that, and bounced back between radio and TV for many years, and then started doing this for fun.
Well, I mean, that's a very commendable kind of history and experience. And to my point, you're a lot more comfortable in front of the camera than I am. So afterwards, if you'd like to drop me a mail with some tips, I'll gladly take those.
You're doing fine. Relax. So the biggest tip is to be natural, and you've got that down. Relax, Mark.
No, thank you. I mean, this is what we love to do, right? It's about whiskey. It's about sharing it with people. So it's hard to get that wrong.
Hey, speaking of that, I saw the dram you poured.
Yes, I thought this would be appropriate.
I have the same bottle.
Snap.
I have, as a matter of fact, I have a bottle and a half of this.
That's brilliant.
2000 vintage.
Yeah, 2000. Barrel number 841.
Let me see what mine was. My barrel was number 26.
All right, of course. But
well, no, it was because mine didn't have to go nearly as far as yours did.
Yeah, by the time we got you, it was So
even though it's 10 a.m., I will pour a little bit so that we can.
That's mighty good of you. Thank you.
Oh, I wouldn't. It's wake up time.
Whiskey on oats without the oats.
Pardon? I've always thought bourbon makes a good breakfast whiskey.
Yeah, bourbon makes a good breakfast whiskey and makes a good lunchtime dram. Just no problems here with drinking whiskey anytime.
Absolutely.
So, Mark, we'd love to, I'd love to just maybe, understand that. So, you've been in broadcasting for decades, and it comes a time where you discover a bit of an interest or a love for whiskey, and you decide, hey, I've got this skill and I've got this passion. Let me try and, smash these two together. And here we are 15 years later. How did that all come about at the time?
Well, it was a happy accident, frankly. I had gotten into whiskey a few years before starting WhiskyCast and was just as an amateur and just loving it and learning everything I could about it. And I have this habit of when I get into something, I tend to go down the rabbit hole and get obsessive about it and start looking and trying to learn everything I can about the subject. Whether it's photography, whiskey, motorsports, if I get into it, I tend to go all the way and go nuts about it.
Right.
And as a journalist, you wind up with a skill set or at least a knowledge base that's a mile wide and an inch deep, because you have to learn a little bit about a lot of different things to be able to cover them. You have to know just enough to be dangerous.
Right. Okay.
And back in 2005, I was working for a company in northern New Jersey. And I heard you also say I live in Pennsylvania. Actually, no, I live in New Jersey. Sorry. Just across the river from Philadelphia. I live in just across the river. It's basically Pennsylvania's 5 miles away. But since they are almost South African-esque in their prohibition with liquor stores right now during the pandemic, I'm not claiming them.
Right.
So basically, in 2005, I was working as a television news producer for a company producing all of our content for one of the major broadcast cable news networks. And this was just around the time or so that Apple had started introducing podcasting support into the iPods of the day. Right. And people were talking about podcasts, and somebody in our organization got the bright idea that we ought to be producing a podcast. I was the poor schmuck that was going to have to make this thing work. Right. Because essentially it's a glorified radio show. Right. And I said, time out. We need to examine this, test it, look at it. I need to do some research before we commit to this thing and put a longtime company brand into a project that we may kill after a few weeks because of the pain in the neck factor. Right. Now, I had actually thought about doing a podcast myself anyway, because one of the things that you never get to do as a journalist in the old days was control your own content, and because you're always working for somebody else. Right. And I saw this could be kind of interesting. And I saw it as a way to further my own whiskey knowledge, because I didn't know a lot. But as a journalist, I found the best way to learn about things is to ask about them and talk to the people who do know stuff. So I figure, okay, if I do this podcast, it gets me a chance to talk to folks. Right. And it gives me a natural opportunity to learn more, and then maybe I can bring some other folks along with me in my journey. So I told the bosses, give me a few weeks, let me go research this. And took my audio gear to Whiskey Fest in New York, got a bunch of interviews. The very first show was with the late, great Parker Beam, who made this whiskey that we're sharing right now, and the late, great Dr. Jim Swan, who was a consultant working with Penderin at the time.
That's a good start. That's
a good start. I can't complain. Got to talk to Jim McEwen from Brookladdy. He was in, I think, episode 2 or 3, and a few other folks, and produced about a few episodes, because I figure if I do this and kill it after a few weeks, nobody's going to notice. Right. And we're not going to put the company brand on the line. I go back, tell them, okay, we can do this. Here's what it's going to take. Here's what the IT guys need to do. Here's how we coordinate it. Here's what we need to do to make the thing work. So all's well and good. We start producing a podcast in addition to all of our other content. And about 6 months later, they decide to close my studio in New Jersey, move it to Washington, lay me off, and hire a kid at a third of my salary to do the job. It happens. That's part of radio, part of TV. So I'm unemployed for a couple of months, still producing the podcast. I get a job in New York, working for Bloomberg TV, doing business news as a producer and writer and editor. Stay with them for 3 years until 2009. We all know what happened in 2008 and 2009 when the financial markets went kablooey. And I survived the first round of layoffs in the company's history in the winter of 2009. I did not survive the second round in the summer of 2009. So got laid off, very good severance package, and that lasted a few months. And by that time, we had some advertising support start to come in for WhiskyCast, a little bit, enough to pay the bills.
Right.
But after a year or so of me producing the show and focusing on it, and trying to find another job in media. That was the year we lost 100,000 media jobs just in the U.S.
Wow.
As newsrooms contracted, newspapers closed, broadcast outlets laid off people. There were no jobs out there. I had one job interview in a year.
Wow.
Despite having a long track record, winning awards, and being pretty good at this thing. So, in the spring of 2010, the women I live with, my wife and 3 daughters, came to me and sat down for what we referred to as a come to Jesus meeting. You might call it an intervention of sorts.
Right.
They said, hey, this thing is really cute and it has some potential to maybe make some money. And you might be able to make it work full time, but you stink at the business side of things.
Right. Well, you have to appreciate the honesty.
And yeah, they were right, because I had kept control of it. I was doing all the advertising, sales, and all the support for it and putting the media kits together. And that's not my strong suit. My strong suit is content.
Right.
Christina's strong suit is in all that other stuff. So they said, you can keep doing this, but you got to let mom take over the business side. And I learned right then and there that the best way to succeed is to give up some control and let other people play to their strengths. And without that, I'd be probably working as a greeter in a Walmart or something like that right now, because we wouldn't be doing WhiskyCast. She literally saved the show, and she deserves all the credit for that. And that's what made it possible. She immediately went out, got more sponsors, and got it to the point now where it's become both of our full-time jobs for the last 11 years.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So, I mean, did you ever think in those early days when you were doing it just kind of as a side gig that looking forward 15 years later, this is where you'd be? I mean, I mean, could you ever have predicted or just guessed that this is how as successful as you'd be?
I did not think so, because until this is actually the longest job one job I've ever had. The longest I'd ever worked in a radio or TV station before was 7 years. And I've already doubled that with this.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what the future held. I figured I'd do this until somebody told me I had to stop when I took a job for them. And they'd say, you can't produce content on your own and work for us.
Yeah.
And that offer never came along.
Wow.
And the stories keep coming. So I didn't think I'd have enough stories to tell. But I mean, it works out.
If you you say not having enough stories to tell, and my sense is, and I'd love to get your feel on that. I mean, 15 years ago, the industry wasn't necessarily as fast moving. I mean, there's a dozen more, several dozen more distilleries now. You didn't have access to the same content. What was Japan doing at the time? So I mean, now there's you're probably even more needed than before. I mean, you always played a very valuable role, and you were kind of a trailblazer.
Thank you.
But I mean, it's how do you keep updated on all the content that is coming out of all the whiskey producing countries?
A lot of Google searches in the news sections, to a lot of keyword searches to basically help me find out what's happening. I get probably 80 to 100 news releases a week.
Wow. Emailed
to me from the various distilleries, and just once you make contact, I just tell them, okay, when you've got news, I need to know about it. And generally, everybody's pretty good about making sure that they keep me updated around the world. When they hear that you've got a global audience, even if it's just in one market, they still want to be seen as a player. So, and this is probably going to sound, I don't want it to sound egotistical, but for some reason, people in the industry have come to accept that if we report on your story on WhiskyCast, it gives you some credibility.
Right.
So it gets you up there. If you're a craft distiller, it gets you up there in regard with the big boys and girls of the industry.
Right.
So that's why they're eager to work with us.
You've done an incredibly impressive job, though, over the last 15 years at one, being consistent. I think that's what I can really appreciate is that, there's, and whiskey bloggers and other podcasts have come and go, doing something on a weekly basis for 15 years. Talk about habit forming. It's almost practically unheard of. So, your consistency, the value you provide to kind of a global audience, and then again, just the amount of information and knowledge that you have to share, the people you speak to. It's, it makes sense why people now look at you as a trusted source, in terms of, who's been around the longest. I think apart from just whiskey podcasts, you're surely one of the longest standing podcasts out there. Right?
Yeah. Christina figured this out a while back. When we started in 2005, iTunes at the time had barely 3,000 podcasts listed in its directory. We were one of the first 3,000 podcasts in iTunes.
Wow.
And just a few weeks ago, they went over 1 million podcasts in their directory. So to be one of the
first.
Yeah, I don't even want to try to figure the percentage in there, but it's and we're clearly the longest running whiskey podcast. There was one a radio whiskey that was a little bit more storytelling and a guy talking about just stories while tasting whiskey, but it wasn't anything like what we're doing. But he stopped doing it a couple of months after we did. That was the only one that I could find at the time.
Yeah. Wow. So in terms of today, 15 years later, how many, and I don't know if these numbers are available, or not available, but if you're willing to share them. But if I'm correct, you are now on 818, episode 818. Is that right?
Did 818 this past weekend. This coming weekend's show will be 819.
Okay.
We've done about 75 episodes of the WhiskyCast tasting panel,
right, which
goes on hiatus a lot. We don't do that show as often. We used to do it every month, but we very rare. We did one episode recently, and we don't really do that one as often as we should. We may wind up just dropping that one here at some point in the near future. We've done something like 70 WhiskyCast HD videos plus all the live webcasts that we've been doing the last few weeks.
And in terms of numbers of listeners and viewers and numbers of how many different countries are tuning in, do you have some of those stats?
We know from our server logs, because we don't do any kind of tracking cookies or anything, and we don't allow our advertisers to do that either. We know from the server logs that we've had listeners to the podcast in more than 180 countries around the world, including places like Saudi Arabia and some of the mainly Muslim countries where alcohol is not even allowed. And we know that there are expats in those countries that are listening.
Right. Wow.
We're going to put the total community size at somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people that are listening.
Wow. Per episode.
I'm sorry?
That's per episode on average.
Well, we track it a little differently because we know that not everybody's going to listen to every episode. So we count our community size as when you have a regular interaction with us. Either you're listening to a couple of episodes a month, or you're interacting with us on social media, or you're watching one of the videos. So we look at it that way, because there are people, for instance, if you look at the podcast directory and you say, oh, I'm not interested in that whiskey, I'm not going to listen to this week, but I'll catch up next week. Well, you're still part of the crowd. You just didn't listen to that one show.
Yeah. Okay. I'm guilty of that. I as much as I absolutely love your show, and I've been a consistent listener, there's times where, it's just kind of a week is a blur. What I do then when I travel, I try and kind of download a few so that when I'm on the plane, you can catch up to some degree.
Right. I do that with some of my other podcasts that I listen to, so I know the feeling.
Yeah, and at the moment, as you heard, so as South Africans, we're not allowed to leave our houses except for very limited circumstances, and so I'm not in the car as much, and that's generally when I listen to my podcasts. I imagine I'm not alone in that, and so I'm definitely a bit behind. So forgive me. I'll make an effort this weekend to catch up.
No, we've actually found that our audience has gone up during all this. because we're getting more downloads because people are catching up and listening to the show now, or are discovering it while they have time to look for new podcasts. And if they go through their existing library of stuff that they've already got, they're looking for something new and they're into whiskey, they do a search, they find us. So we've actually seen our numbers go up a little bit, which is good.
And what's nice is as well is that, where a lot of businesses are at the moment, unable to operate as they usually would, you seem to be busier than ever, because not only are you doing the weekly, the podcast, but you're doing twice weekly live streams similar to this, but with lots of guests more regularly. But I mean, that's also keeping you busy. Yeah.
Fortunately, we have worked from home for the last 10 or 11 years, and I've pretty much always produced WhiskyCast from home. Right now I'm sitting in my office here in studio at home, and it's been easy to do the content because we didn't have to go anywhere. We were, in the last few months, we had taken a co-working office space 6 blocks from here, within walking distance, to be able to get out of the house and be able to focus on work, because when you do work from home, as everybody's realizing, you get distractions like pets that want to be walked and laundry that has to be done and things like that. And so we had taken an office space, a single office just a few blocks away, that I was using as the studio. We were working up there 8 hours a day to be able to focus, but that's closed because of lockdowns. So brought everything back home, and it's relatively easy because I've got all the tools I need here to produce the show, because I was used to always being able to produce it on the road. Everything I need to produce the podcast, I can take on the road to whiskey festivals.
Right.
So when I'm traveling, that's why we never missed a week, was because I can produce it with the portable gear that I carry plus a laptop.
Right. Well, it's brilliant that you can still generate the content and get it out to everyone. And as you say, a lot of people are now home, so more eyeballs, more ears listening to what you have to offer. So I imagine you spend a good chunk of your day kind of working, which happens to be whiskey related, but it's still work to some degree. And do you struggle between sometimes kind of balancing the work with the passion, and sitting down and actually just enjoying a dram? Is that a challenge?
No, because what I'll do is, if I'm going to sit down and taste, then I'm going to focus. I've got just off to my right here is the tasting table that are samples that have come in that I need to taste and do tasting notes on for the show. And when I'm sitting focusing on those, I will focus on 4 or 5 of those, and try to taste those over the course of an evening. But if I'm not tasting, I'm perfectly happy sitting down in front of the TV set, turn a movie on or something, and sit down and relax with a dram or turn on some music or something.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That's brilliant. I struggle sometimes to do that, to be honest, where I just, sometimes you're so busy with work, and yes, work is whiskey, but you don't get to that kind of dram, you don't get that half an hour quiet time where you can just kind of enjoy the dram.
Right.
I'm glad you don't have that problem.
Well, no, I still have the problem. It's just good because one of the hazards of working from home is that you sit down here, I go down the rabbit hole, and by the time I look up, it's 8 o'clock in the evening. I've been working all day, and I forgot to eat lunch, and they're telling me, Dad, there's food up here for dinner. You want to come upstairs and eat? And so I get wrapped around that and wrapped around the axle, and we'll sometimes just forget about all that stuff. But that's basically writing or video production or audio production and stuff like that. It's not necessarily sitting down here dramming.
Right, gotcha.
So there's more to it than just sitting down here and doing tasting notes all day long.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the fun part.
I mean, after 818 episodes and multiple video contents and etc. I mean, is there anyone that you'd like to interview that you haven't? I mean, surely you've ticked everyone off the list. Is there any distillery that you haven't quite gotten around to yet that is on your list? Or
there are many. Most of the interviews I've done have been over the phone. So there are a lot of distilleries I have not been to. Generally, when I travel, if I'm traveling, it's on a press trip, and I don't control my own agenda.
Right.
So there are distilleries that I've driven by or been driven by where I couldn't stop. And it's, hey, one of these days I'm going to stop. But one of the rules I have is that if I am on a press trip for somebody, or if I'm on a press trip where somebody has invited me and is covering my expenses, I will not go visit their competition on that trip. I don't think it's fair to my hosts to do that unless they give me permission and they say, hey, look, yeah, we've got some downtime. If you want to go over there and see the guys, go right ahead. We got no problem with it.
Right.
And that happens occasionally.
That's very respectful. That makes sense.
So there are a lot of distilleries that are smaller ones. For instance, I've probably been by, let's see, Edredour, I've been by a few dozen times, going up the A9 in Scotland. Tomatin, same thing. Most of those distilleries along the A9 I've been by and have never had a chance to stop because I'm usually going from Edinburgh up to Speyside, and it's not been in a position where I could stop. So there are plenty of distilleries that I've not been to yet, and I've not been to James Sedgwick over in Wellington. I want to get there and see Andy. I think he's still watching.
I think he is. But
I want to come down there and see you guys at some point.
We do need to get you here. I mean, it's something that we've kind of spoken about, once or twice, not enough. But I think now it's time. And hopefully after this, there'll be a greater, awareness of you from the South African audience. And we can get you down here for the whiskey show, or
Sounds good.
To see Andy.
But for instance, I finally got down to Australia and New Zealand in the last year. I still haven't been to Japan. Okay. So I've not visited the Suntory and Nika distilleries yet. There are all sorts of craft distilleries around here in the U.S. that I've not seen. And there are plenty of distilleries in Europe along the continent that I'd love to get a chance to go visit as well, that I haven't always had a chance to go see. So there's still a lot out there to explore. And there are people that I've not interviewed yet that I want to. Just yesterday, I put in a request with the Macallan for Sarah Burgess, their lead whiskey maker. I've not had her on the show, and her predecessor, Bob Delgarno, never wanted to do interviews. So never got him on the show.
Right.
Excuse me for a second. Didn't want to cough into the microphone.
No problem.
So there are people who don't want to be the focus of their brands, and they don't like to do interviews as much. For instance, or they're just new in the job, and there are people that I've wanted to get on the show that we can't get now because the brands don't want to put people out. There are brands who don't want to make people available for interviews because they don't want to be seen as trying to capitalize on the downtime everybody has during these lockdowns and the pandemic. And I respect that.
Right.
One of the folks I'd like to talk to is Ebony Major. She's the new blender for Bullet Bourbon in the States. And Ebony is one of the very few African-American blenders in the business. And I want to get her on the show, but I've been told it's going to take some time because Diageo doesn't want to make folks available right now because they're focused on work and what they have to do working from home. And they have enough stuff on their plate without doing interviews. And they also don't want to be seen as taking advantage of a pandemic. And I got to respect that.
Yeah, you can understand it, but I think there is a counter argument there. But I mean, that's fine.
Oh yeah, I've made the counter argument, but I don't control I can't force people to do interviews if they don't want to.
So I mean, Mark, how good is your memory? And that might seem like a strange question, but it strikes me that if your memory is good after 818 episodes, there should be nothing about whiskey or a distillery or a producer that you don't know.
Oh, I'm still learning stuff all the time. I'm still learning. I learned something with every episode, with everybody I talk to. Matter of fact, when we get done with this webcast, I'm going to get on the phone with a professor over in Scotland who's working on a brand new strain of wheat that will behave better when it's distilled and won't get sticky in the stills and stuff and cause problems for distillers, and would allow the guys who are making grain whiskey to use more wheat instead of maize.
Oh, wow. That's very cool.
And that's unusual. We just did a show a few weeks ago with the folks at the University of Kentucky who are working on what they call the American White Oak Genome Project, where they're doing the DNA sequencing for the American white oak tree that we all depend on in the whiskey industry for barrels.
Wow.
Because they're trying to do the DNA sequencing on it so that if we ever had a catastrophe and had a significant impact on the American white oak forests, theoretically you could use the DNA sequencing to try to recreate that wood if you had a problem.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's something that will benefit the entire whiskey industry. I mean, there are things we're learning about all the time.
Yeah.
I do not consider myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, I've got a good memory and I can pull stuff off when I need it, but I don't know everything there is. I've never made whiskey in my life. I almost flunked high school chemistry. So and I kid you not about that. I slept through most of my high school chemistry course, and if I'd known that I was going to be writing about and broadcasting about the distilling industry and about a chemical process, I would have paid a lot more attention.
Yeah. There's great irony there, right? I mean, something that at the time you just couldn't apply to anything you were interested in, and times change. Now you wish you had more insight.
Well, no, it was because the class was in the late afternoon. I was dog tired by the end of the class, and it was the next to last class of the day, so I'd just sit there and fall asleep.
Yeah, but you might have to revisit those classes.
I'm sorry?
You might have to revisit those classes. Just go back and
Fortunately, I've got enough expert chemical engineers that I can talk to you about the stuff I need to know.
I'm sure you've got a very impressive Rolodex. If there is something you need to know, you know the right person to call. So it's not about what you know, it's about who you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's we've got this ready database of distillers and folks who are just more than willing to help. That's the great thing about this industry, is that there are no dumb questions, and if you ask somebody, they'll give you a straight answer about 95% of the time. Yeah. I think I've only caught maybe one or two people in the entire 15 years of WhiskyCast, or nearly 15 years, trying to BS me.
Yeah, I trust you called them out on it.
Yeah, I called them out privately on it, and they've not been back on the show ever since.
Okay.
And I won't name names just to protect the guilty here.
So how has that changed? Because as you say, now you have access and you know the right people and the right departments and the right companies to speak to. But I mean, when you were first starting out, that must have been quite a challenge, trying to get hold of the right people. So how were those early days for you?
It was easy, actually, because what I just did was the distilleries and the companies that had websites, they all had these contact us links. And all I did was just go to the contact me link and send them an email saying, hi, I'm a reporter. This is what I've been doing for years and years. I'm now producing a whiskey podcast series. And please put me on your mailing list for news releases. When you have something going on that you need people to know about, please just add me to your mailing list so that I get your news releases. Never asked for samples, never asked for anything other than just an emailed news release, put me on your mailing list.
Right.
And they all did, because they said, we think this is great. We want to support you. And it wasn't until about a month and a half later that the first sample box showed up at the door on Christmas Eve.
Good timing.
And just completely out of the blue, never requested it. And ever since then, that's the genesis for the wall behind me.
How many samples would you say on average you get a week or a month?
Oh, God. Sometimes none. Sometimes 2 or 3 boxes. And there are times when I'll go away and I'll come back and my desk is full of packages.
Okay.
If I'm gone for 5 or 10 days, I'll come back, the desk is full of packages. We joke about the whiskey ferry around here, and that's the nickname that my daughters gave the UPS and FedEx drivers when they were younger, because the guys were dropping off whiskey packages all the time.
There's nothing better than a whiskey delivery. And to all
nothing
all the whiskey guys and the South African whiskey community watching who have orders that are waiting for delivery, we'll gladly be your whiskey ferries as soon as we can.
I saw Lee just posted down there that Lee needs a whiskey ferry. Yes, we all need a whiskey ferry.
We all need, no kidding. And the whiskey ferry at the moment is prohibited and
yeah, I know.
Down, yeah. Mark, what's next for WhiskyCast? Not that there needs to be. I mean, you offer a wonderful, valuable service on a weekly basis, which is more than enough. But I know over the years you've tried different things, the video content, the tasting panel. Anything else that we can kind of look forward to in the months or years to come?
More of the same for right now. We are looking at some ideas, but nothing I'm really ready to talk about yet. Not because it's still in the early stages, because Christina and I will brainstorm ideas. She'll come up with ideas, and I'll eventually come around to them. And there's no secret to this. She's the idea person, and I'm usually one going, why? Well, we can't do this for this, and this reasons. And then she'll figure out the solutions, and I'll say, okay, yes, we can do that. Okay, that would work. And yes, it takes a while to get me to come around to say yes, because it just does at times. We're working on some ideas.
Okay, we look forward to those. I'd imagine it's quite difficult because doing a weekly podcast, must consume a lot of time. So, any other project or endeavor you want to kind of, venture, you need to make that time available, which is obviously, quite a finite commodity.
Well, right now we've got more time to do stuff because I'm not traveling. The last trip I took I haven't traveled since I got back from New Zealand in, I think, March 9th. And everything I've got as of right now through the rest of the summer is pretty much dead. Is not going to happen. We have been looking. Well, you asked about what we're planning. We have been talking about a way to celebrate the 15th anniversary this fall.
Okay.
And it would likely be with a major whiskey show. The problem is I really don't want to say any more about that because we don't know if shows are going to be able to happen in person. And until we get some definitive word on that from the health officials, we don't know.
Yeah,
because I'm on events on our calendar of events that have already been postponed 4 times and rescheduled.
I think that the safe bet now is just to rather say, not to have a new date and just to say, until further notice.
Yeah. I fully don't expect to travel until the end of the year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult one for all events, whiskey and other. We kind of just have to sit tight and watch the space. Mark, so I mean, you in terms of being based in the States, I know you and obviously the podcast, you do give you give an equal kind of footing to American news and what's happening with the whiskey scene there. At this point in time, I mean, what is the vibe and what is the sentiment of some of the smaller distillers as well as the big ones? How is the industry looking now with this massive kind of impact to their business?
Well, this industry is in trouble. Can I call out Morris here? Because Morris just said some really nasty things about the Whiskey Ferry.
I think so Morris is a good man. We know Morris.
Yeah, it was just because it cost him 5,000 rand this week when the Whiskey Ferry made him win a spot in the Port Charlotte 16 ballot. Yeah. Oh, isn't that a shame, Morris? I'm not even going to get to try that one.
Yeah, I mean, you have to enter the ballot. So, hard to have sympathy. You now own a wonderful bottle of whiskey. So,
I mean, I'm sure, Morris, that somebody will be glad to take that off your hands for something approximating what you paid for it. Okay, let's get now to your question about the American whiskey scene. It's in trouble because we have approximately 2,100 distilleries right now. A handful of the big boys, but we're talking like everything from the small craft farm distilleries all the way up to the big ones like the Jim Beams, the Maker's Marks, the Heaven Hills of the world that are making 10 million barrels a year. Yeah. Filling millions of barrels.
2,100 whiskey distilleries.
Well, spirits distilleries. Not all of them make whiskey, but a lot of them make whiskey, but there are some that just make gin and vodka. But 2,100.
Understood.
90% of those depended on the revenue from their tasting rooms, from their on-site tasting rooms and their on-site bottle shops for their revenue because they're so small where they may only make 500 cases a year. And that's a rounding error for any distributor to carry. So they're not getting much distribution outside of their local area. So a lot of these folks sell what they can or depend on their in-house sales and tours at their bottle shop in-house and for the in-house cocktail bars and tastings that they do. Well, those have all been shut down pretty much around the country. So a lot of these folks are in deep trouble. We just reported on a survey from the Distilled Spirits Council and the American Distilling Institute, I think last week, that as many as half of those distilleries, or 2/3 of those distilleries they've lost 2/3 of their sales industry-wide on average. And 2/3 of them are really doubtful about whether they'll be in business 6 months from now. Wow. And nearly half of the distillery employees in this country have been laid off. Now, there are a few that have been able to get some aid from the government through some of these relief programs that have come out, but there are a lot of distillery, because making whiskey is a long-term business to begin with. As you well know, you got to put this stuff down and lay it down for 2 or 3 years to make it any good, to make it even worth selling.
Yeah.
And if you're not able to even buy the grains to keep making whiskey and to keep laying stock down because you don't have any revenue coming in, there's been some benefits in terms of tax breaks, or at least in terms of tax deferments in paying federal and state excise taxes. And a lot of these folks switched over to producing hand sanitizer because that was in short supply.
Right.
But a lot of the folks have had to go back to making whiskey because the supplies that you need for industrial grade alcohol for hand sanitizer are in even shorter supply. I was talking with a distiller yesterday who said they couldn't get the isopropyl alcohol or the denaturants they needed to make hand sanitizer unless they could buy a train tanker car load.
Jeez.
And they don't have the resources to handle that, to buy it, one, or to store it until they can use it, or to use it all. So we have a lot of distillers that are in big trouble right now. And I think the industry is going to look a lot different a year from now than it did 2 months ago. I think we're going to see a lot fewer distillers in business because a lot of these guys are not going to be able to make it.
Yeah, the sad truth is, not everyone is going to survive this, this kind of, our current circumstances. Not just in the whiskey industry, but globally, across all kinds of industries. But, as kind of whiskey enthusiasts, I mean, that's obviously heartbreaking to hear. Not just the whiskey, but the livelihoods of the individuals, the passion that they have for what they do. I mean, that's really kind of that's really heartbreaking to hear.
Especially because a lot of these people were successful. A lot of the smaller distillers have been successful in other careers, but decided that they wanted to make whiskey out of passion and took their life savings and plowed it into building a distillery or to sourcing whiskey. And if you don't have a distribution contract now as a small distiller, you're not going to get one.
Yeah. Oh.
So if you can't have your tasting room open and you've got stuff ready to bottle, you're screwed pretty much.
Wow. So, I mean, I'd also imagine, as you said, there's a lot of kind of, sourcing and white labeling, so to speak, that happens in the US. I'd imagine then, again, as you say, not only from proprietary bottlings, but these white labels and the kind of the assortment of brands we have are probably going to kind of be culled to quite an extent over the coming years.
Yeah, because you have companies like MGP, which is the largest supplier of sourced whiskey. Their stock prices actually were going down earlier this year because they weren't selling as much as they had told the stock markets and the analysts that they were going to sell. They expected to sell because the demand was starting to fall for it, or the prices were starting to go up for the aged stuff they did have. And a lot of that stuff goes into store brands too. Total Wine, the sort of what we have for a nationwide chain around here in the U.S., we don't really have any major nationwide chains because of the way the system is set up. Total Wine comes about as close as you can get. They're in about maybe 20 states right now. They have a bunch of house brands that they source whiskeys for. And they make more money on those than they do on selling a lot of the craft stuff or anything other than the big boys. So they're going to focus on those in their stores when it comes to sales and trying to keep the markets going.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, and in terms of, if we look at kind of, the Scottish landscape, lots of new distilleries over the last decade, not nearly as many as kind of the American, scene. But do you think to a lesser degree, but same kind of consequences that we can expect coming out of Scotland? I
think we're going to see a few go under because a lot of those were also tourism plays.
Right.
And if you can't travel, if you're locked down and you can't go anywhere, and you're going to be nervous about going out in public for the next couple of 3 years, a lot of those smaller distilleries were also dependent on what they could sell as distillery exclusives and what they could sell in their shops. So they were also dependent on tourism, largely. I mean, the UK market and the Scottish market can handle a little bit of domestic tourism, but we're not going to see Americans traveling to Scotland or South Africans traveling to Scotland or Europeans traveling to Scotland in great numbers for at least the next year or two. Same thing in Ireland. And I think you could see potentially a couple of these smaller distilleries that are shoestring funded go under.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a sad times indeed. And also, you look historically at the whiskey, the kind of history, and there's always ups and downs, and booms and busts. We know this. Although if this is a bust, it's not something anyone saw coming. It's not, and it's completely out of people's control. It wasn't the whiskey lock from the 1890s or some kind of it's just out of our control. Hard to plan.
Yeah, we were starting to see signs of oversupply, or wondering whether the industry could absorb all of the whiskey that's being produced, because the blenders don't need stuff from all these little small distilleries. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these folks were hoping on single malt sales. Well, keep in mind, we also still have the tariff issue over here. Those guys were all hoping to sell into the U.S. when our administration put that 25% tariff on single malts from Scotland. That cut single malt exports in the last quarter of 2019 by about 25%.
Yeah.
And there are small brands now that can't, or their export market dried up to the States because of the tariffs. So you have a multiple whammy here.
Yeah. It's gonna be difficult times ahead. Mark, I'm cognizant of your time, but are you happy to just answer a few audience questions?
Yeah, of course. I've already told the folks that the professor that I'm interviewing in about half an hour or so that this was going on, so that I might be a few minutes late. So yeah, let's do it. Wonderful. I see that question from Dean about how long to finish cleaning my shelves.
All right.
Because I joked last week, I'd posted pictures on social media about having to dust all this, because I only dust these shelves about once every 12 to 18 months because of the pain in the neck factor.
And have you done a clean? Is it all spot?
I did most of it last Friday.
Okay.
And finished it up on Saturday.
Right. Well, it's looking very attractive there behind you. So we have a question from Peter. Peter's asking if we would ask you what is new and upcoming bourbon that you need to keep an eye on, what would that be? So in terms of new and upcoming bourbon brands or distilleries that we should keep an eye on over here, what would you let us?
Okay, it's hard for me to answer that one because I don't know who's exporting to South Africa. One of the benefits that you guys have in common with us is that South Africa and the U.S. are the only countries that mandate 750 ml bottles.
Yes.
So theoretically, it should be easy for anybody that wants to make bourbon here to export to South Africa, because they don't have to do a special bottling like they do for Europe.
Right.
So
we don't get much, just so that you know. I mean,
tell me who's exporting there, and I can tell you who to watch out for.
We get the big brands, but we get BT, we get the Buffalo Trace stable, we obviously get Jack, we get a little bit of Evan Williams. We occasionally will get some Four Roses, some Michters, but it's the bourbon offering, generally bourbon and rye, American whiskey as a category, it's generally slim pickings. It's generally the big brand names that are available. Bullets, of course, from Diageo. So in terms of the smaller players, unless as WhiskyBrother, we try and kind of keep it interesting. We try and get our hands on a lot of these guys.
I will tell you one to check out.
Okay, please do.
Jephthah Creed, and I apologize for this being reversed. This was what I was going to pour until I saw you had until I saw you with that Evan Williams 2000. Jephthah Creed. It's a small family-owned distillery in Shelbyville, Kentucky, just east of Louisville, along Interstate 64. They grow all the grains themselves for their bourbon. This is their 4-grain straight bourbon, and one of the ingredients in here is Bloody Butcher corn, which is a really red. It's called that because of the color of the corn. The kernels are really, really red, and it adds a lot of flavor to it. And I was really impressed when I tasted the bourbon last year, and they just finally came out with it. And if you can get it, I would urge you to contact the distillery and see if they'll ship you a few cases.
I think we'll do just that. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you can import without having a distributor, or if you can do imports yourselves. So I would do that. Another one I just tasted this week is Frey Ranch from Nevada.
Okay.
They just released a straight bourbon where, once again, Colby Frey was on our webcast on Wednesday. his family's been farming in the northern Nevada region near the Sierra Nevada mountains, east of Reno for 150 years or more.
Wow.
And he got into making whiskey a few years ago, and just released earlier this year a 4-grain bourbon with corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley that I thought was excellent.
Okay, brilliant.
And
the name you said, sorry, was?
Frey Ranch, Frey Ranch.
Frey Ranch. Okay, that's and
then obviously, and then if you can get Balcones,
yes,
from Texas, you know Balcones, right?
Yeah, we know Balcones. We don't get consistently, but we've managed to kind of get some limited stock every now and again.
I can put you in touch with. I know folks.
Okay, you know plenty of folks. Like I said,
I know people. I'll put you in touch because once again, it's easy for them because they can just put it on put a pallet together and send it to you with a bunch of different stuff because they don't have to mess around with changing bottle sizes.
Yeah, so brilliant. All right, so that answers Peter's question. Thank you so much. We have a question from Nigel saying, how easy is it to organize a tour of distilleries in the US? Are most of them open for visits and tastings?
Not right now, but yes, when they're open. It depends on where you're going. If you're going to Kentucky, there is the Kentucky Bourbon Trail,
yep,
where you can get a passport that you can get stamped when you go to. They've got the main Kentucky Bourbon Trail with the big distilleries, and then the Kentucky Bourbon Trail Craft Tour with a bunch of the smaller distilleries in the state. Last time I checked, I think there's something like 37 distilleries total on that tour, on those two tours between them, that draw about 1.2 million visitors a year. There's also the Tennessee Whiskey Trail, which covers Jack Daniels, George Dickel, and a lot of their craft distilleries. They actually get even more visitors than Kentucky does. Okay. And it's not because of Jack Daniels, it's because of a couple of the moonshine and craft distilleries that are down in the area around Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge in southern Tennessee near the Georgia border that are tourist havens and can draw upwards of 2 to 3 million visitors a year just to those distilleries because people go to visit Gatlinburg, Tennessee, or Pigeon Forge, which is where Dolly Parton's theme park, Dollywood, is located. And it's a real easy touristy thing to go visit the distillery and go check out the Moonshine Distillery. So they get a couple of million people a year. Texas has a whiskey trail now. There's also whiskey trails, I believe, in New York. There are pretty much almost any state that has multiple distilleries, the distillers have gotten together because they realize that a rising tide lifts all boats. Absolutely. And it's in their best interests to work together and attract visitors to promote their state's bourbon. So before you go, figure out what states you're going to and just do a search on, say, for instance, if you're going to Missouri, J. Rieger and Company in Kansas City has tours, but just do, say, Missouri distillery tours. And I know where you went to school in Missouri, Mark, so just do Missouri distillery tours and you're bound to see possibly even a state tour for distilleries in that state.
Excellent.
Because they all want tourism.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I hope, well, as soon as people are able to travel, I hope there's lots of support. I see a few of the audience members saying they had trips planned, in the coming, months or year. So, hopefully those trips can just be postponed slightly and we can support those small distillers.
Yeah.
We have a question from Gary saying, Mark, what is the most prized bottle in your collection, or one of? I know
the most prized bottle in my collection. I don't really, well, in terms of whiskey quality, no. I wouldn't pick one as the most prized. The most prized bottle, the one bottle I have that I will never open, and unfortunately I am hooked up here, or I would go get it because it's across the room. It is a bottle of Enoch 12-year-old. The reason it's special is not because of the whiskey inside. It's because of the label. Several years ago, the folks at Inver House did a Your Enoch Moment promotion.
I remember that.
And what they did was the contest where if you sent in a photo of, quote, Your Enoch Moment, the winners got to have a bespoke bottle for them, created for them by the illustrator Peter Arkle, who was doing their labels. Well, I was one of a handful of journalists that was invited to send in a photo to sort of seed this thing when they were launching it. And the first photo I sent in, they rejected because it was me holding my infant grandson for the first time. And they said, nope, we can't put a baby on the label. Okay, I get that.
Right, makes sense.
So the second one I sent them was of me laying in the hammock out in the backyard with our Old English sheepdog Frizzle sitting up beside me on the ground with her head on my lap. And so they took that one, and Peter did a great illustration where he put the bottle on her head and had her balancing it on her head while I held a glass in my hand.
Okay.
And they turned that into the canister and the label for the bottle. There's only one of those. I can always get another Enoch 12. That's easy. I can't replace that bottle.
Yeah, that's a one of a kind.
We lost Frizz a few years ago because she was very old, and she passed away while I was on a trip to Scotland, actually. And so I have that bottle, and as long as I have that bottle, and I'm looking at it right now, as long as I have that one, I still have it. Reminds me of her, so that's the one I'll never open.
That's a beautiful bottle to have in your collection.
So I'd show it to you, but I'd have to unhook everything, and
that's okay.
I see a question here from Dean Blumenthal about the Elijah Craig Straight Rye, and I think where's that sucker?
What's it's so South Africa in terms of consumption. Yeah, well,
it's good.
Question. It's good.
I like it. They're a sponsor, but I like it anyway.
What so the South African kind of consumption is very much, and I think we're indicative, or we're much like other countries. So you have kind of Scotch fans that they're whiskey fans, but they don't really kind of recognize what bourbon has to offer. From my experience, it's just been about kind of introducing them to bourbon. They've maybe tried one particular bourbon that everyone knows. They drank too much of it in university days, and they think they don't like bourbon. What would your kind of advice be to individuals who are maybe new to bourbon? They're whiskey drinkers, but they're new to bourbon. What would you say to those individuals?
Add water at first, because it's going to have more tannins. It's going to be oakier because remember they're using new oak, so it's taking a lot more out of the wood. So you may like your Scotch whiskey neat, but what I would do is add some water immediately to any bourbon when you're just trying it for the first time, because the flavors are going to be more intense from the oak tannins in the wood to the spices, and just add more water to it than you normally would, and then gradually add less and less water as you get used to it.
Okay, well, good advice.
So that's what I would do.
Another question from Gary saying, Mark, besides MGP, what other distilleries are making spirits and maturing for the market to purchase to create their own brands? So for individuals who are watching who may not know, MGP is a kind of it's a big producer of various styles of American whiskey, but they don't bottle under their own brand. They
Yes,
sell.
they do now. Let me correct you on that. They do now.
And what's that brand? Is it MGP or is there?
No, they have several small brands. The George Remus bourbon brand is theirs. They bought that brand from the guys who were sourcing it for them.
Okay.
Or they were sourcing it from them. They also own, the Rossville Rye brand. They have a Tanner Creek bourbon that's only sold in Indiana.
Okay.
And I'm trying to remember, they also have a gin, but they have a couple of, and Eight and Sand, which is a bourbon that's named after a railroad term. So they bottle those themselves. And
so
MGP is actually the old Seagram's distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana.
Okay.
And MGP is a company in Iowa that bought it several years ago. But this distillery has been around for 150 years. So they know how to make good whiskey.
Right. And they make a lot of it.
They make a lot of it.
Other people's brands.
But it depends on who you talk to, because a lot of distilleries will produce excess consumption, have excess capacity, but they don't talk about it. They'll tell you they're running at full steam because they're trying to meet the bourbon demand.
Right.
But they will, if you know somebody in the industry and you're connected and you ask, hey, do you have any bulk bourbon you can sell or bulk whiskey? You might be able to cut deals. There are some that specialize in sourcing or in distilling for other folks. But you have to ask around. It's not something they make a big deal about.
Okay. Do MGP do tours?
No. It is, put it this way, I got to tour it as part of a press tour, but they are generally, the only time of the year they're open to the public is when Lawrenceburg hosts its whiskey festival in the fall. And at that point, they'll offer tours for one day. But other than that, they're not open for tours unless you're in the industry and you're considering buying something from them.
Got you. Okay. And then maybe let's just do another 2 questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
We've got a question that says, is there price gouging in stores in the US, or is it a big problem, particularly on brands like the Antique Collections and Pappy's?
Oh, yeah.
I'd imagine so.
Yeah, there is price gouging because here's the deal. In most states, retailers get to set the final price, period. In some states like New York, it's actually illegal for the distributors and the manufacturers to hammer on a store for overcharging or overpricing. They can't retaliate. So I have seen, there is a store that I shop, liquor store that I shop at occasionally, that I won't buy this bottle from them, but they sell the Van Winkle Lot B, or the old Rip Van Winkle 10-year-old bourbon. Yeah, they got last time I was in there, they had the old Rip Van Winkle 10-year-old bourbon, which has a recommended retail price from Buffalo Trace of $69.99 a bottle. They sell that sucker for $699.99 a bottle.
Wow.
I've looked at them and I go, that's 10 times the MSRP. And they go, yeah, we know, and we don't care. Somebody will pay it.
Yeah.
And I've seen even worse with the Pappies. I've seen Pappies that were supposed to be priced at maybe $199, priced at $2,000 a bottle.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
It's insane.
I mean, they must. The sad part is they must still be selling them because the allocation of those is so low. The retailers only get a handful of bottles, and they know that there's a demand on the secondary market.
Yeah, because a lot of these bottles never hit the market because they go to the back of the store, in the storeroom, and they're held for special clients.
Yeah.
Or they're held. You don't just walk into a store and say, "Do you have any Pappy?" and expect to buy a bottle.
Yeah.
The only places you can do that is in some of the control states. Utah, believe it or not, which is a state that is not known for its friendliness towards liquor because of the Mormon Church, is actually one of the places where you might get lucky and find a bottle of Pappy, because their liquor monopoly, the state liquor agency, puts it out at MSRP by state law, and they put it out on the shelf. So if you're lucky enough to be in there in October when the Pappy releases come out and they get their allocation, if you're in the right store in the right place at the right time, you might actually be able to get a bottle of Pappy for the MSRP.
Right. Yeah, and you'd be a lucky individual if that is the case.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen.
I'm just having a quick look through any other questions to see if there's something of interest here. A quick question from Ian, just saying, how many whiskey countries have you visited?
Okay, let's see. Scotland, England, France, Sweden, Ireland, of course, Canada, Belgium, Taiwan, and I don't want to hear anybody complain that it's not a country, India, Australia, New Zealand. That would be 11, maybe 12, and I'm probably whiffing on one. Spain, Italy, 13, 14, that's 13.
It's an impressive list already.
Yeah, that's 13 that's the best I can think of right away.
Okay. And then I'll make this the last question for you. We've got Will asking, what's your favorite bourbon? And I know that's difficult, so let's just say what's kind of one of your favorite bourbons at the moment?
Whoa. I never pick a favorite.
One of a pool.
I don't pick one because I don't get to taste all of them. Not everybody sends me samples. Right. And I don't generally buy whiskey in bars because I've generally got a better selection at home and it's overpriced. And when I'm at home, I don't have to worry about driving drunk.
Right.
So I drink at home and drink responsibly. But one of the ones I really enjoy, and yeah, they're a sponsor, but this new Heaven Hill bottled in bond bourbon that they just came out with, limited release a few months ago, that replaced a 7-year-old that replaced the old 6-year-old bottled in bond. And I don't think I can I reach that one? Is it where I can reach it? No, it is not where I can reach it easily. I'm sorry. But they just came out with a new release of it, and that's one, if I have a go-to bourbon, that would be the one. And I don't have a lot of it left, so I have to try to find some more of it.
You have to stretch it out there.
Yeah, because it's only in a handful of states. They don't have a lot of it.
Okay.
And yeah, that would be sort of my go-to bourbon. But I have a whole bunch of different whiskeys I can go to whenever I want. And I generally don't pick favorites because I don't get to taste everything.
Very diplomatic of you.
Well, I've got tasting notes on the website for almost 2,900 different whiskeys.
Wow.
And there are 8 that I've scored 98 points.
Right. Wow.
Including one bourbon, which was an Old Forester President's Choice that was bottled in 1964 as a single barrel.
Okay. Wow, that sounds
that I
brilliant.
got to taste after a news conference at Brown-Forman in Louisville a few years ago that we got to taste. But that's one I scored 98 points, but that would be my highest scoring bourbon.
Okay. I'd keep an eye out for it, but I have a suspicion it's going to be hard to find or impossible to find. And if it's available on auction, it's going to be for eye-watering amounts.
It will not be available at auction because what it was back then, the Old President's Choice that Old Forester did was bottled by, I think, George Garvin Brown IV, who was the president of the company of Brown-Forman at the time. And he picked the barrels for specific customers. Okay. And the customer got the whole barrel. In this case, it was sold to a banker in North Carolina who had passed on, and his family contacted Brown-Forman and offered them the remaining stock.
Okay.
Well, and Brown-Forman bought it back.
Okay. Interesting story. Mark, before I let you go, I think I'd love you to give a plug to the live streams you're doing, and I know you have one tonight, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Due to the time difference, it starts at 11 o'clock South African time.
Right.
But maybe just give a shout out or give a plug to those. Who are your guests this evening?
Right. We do those on Wednesdays and Fridays at 5 p.m. New York time, which I think is 11 a.m. or 11 p.m.
11 p.m. South African
11
time.
p.m., 6-hour time difference. And tonight, on Fridays, we generally do a whiskey writers roundtable where we sit around and shoot the breeze for an hour and try to solve the problems of the whiskey world and just have fun. Tonight, my guests are going to be Neil Ridley and Joel Harrison Greer from Cask Strength Creative and writers of a number of award-winning whiskey and spirits books. And Maggie Kimbrell will be joining us from American Whiskey Magazine. She's one of the content editors for the magazine, and she also does some writing for Whiskey Magazine as well. And we may have a little surprise towards the end of the show that you'll have to tune in to see.
Okay, we'll do that. And then you're also running Wednesday shows as well, right?
Right. Wednesdays, we generally have panels of distillers. We're still working the panel together for this one. Trying to think who else is going to be on that one. I know Lisa Wicker from Widow Jane is going to be on that panel. Who else? Oh, I'm whiffing right now, and I'm going to kick myself for this one later.
How long do you plan on keeping those up for?
I'm starting to think that this might become a permanent thing.
Okay.
We're going to keep doing them as long as the lockdowns happen, and because right now it's easy to get guests for the most part because the ambassadors and the distillers aren't traveling.
Yeah, people are home, absolutely.
And here's my thinking on this is that I think we're going to see a lot less travel by the master distillers and blenders. I think because now that they've figured out that they can do tastings like this virtually and just meet with folks virtually, I think that they might decide to say, we're going to leave Richard Patterson in Scotland or Bill Lumsden and have them just do tastings with a local ambassador present to do the pouring and stuff and to answer any questions. But it would be easier for them to not have to travel, because if you send Richard Patterson or Bill Lumsden or Jim McEwen or any of those guys to the States or to Asia or to South Africa, you've got to come up with enough stuff to justify a week's worth of business for them.
Absolutely.
To keep them busy. But they can meet with an individual whiskey club or lead a whiskey tasting from their office for an hour or two and not have to travel.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see more of that.
I completely agree with you, and I look forward to that. At the moment there's kind of a bombardment, but I think going forward, when on a monthly basis, or like now for Gilles, they're streaming Ardbeg, Brooklady, they're doing for Gilles Days live. That's brilliant, because most of us can't get there. I'm sure there's a lucky few that can, but a lot of us miss out on those events. And now
many of us will never get there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's brilliant. All right. Well, Mark, I really want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I've been a fan and a follower for not exactly 15 years, but probably at least 10. And a regular listener. And I mean, judging by the comments, people are very interested in what you have to say. It's great to get an American perspective in terms of kind of whiskey as well. So, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And to everyone watching, I highly encourage you, listen to the podcast, go watch the live streams. And thank you for your services to the kind of whiskey community, Mark.
Thank you, Mark, and I appreciate it. And I saw somebody post in the comments that you guys need to have some more bourbon tastings down there. I'll tell you what, if we work it out and I can come down there, well, I'll bring a couple of bottles from back here and we'll do a fun bourbon tasting. Brilliant.
Well, let's between Whiskey Brother and Andy Watts, there's two good reasons to get you.
Yeah.
We can fill a week. Not that you need a week's itinerary, but we can fill a week's.
Well, if I'm traveling to South Africa, I'm spending a week. I want to see the country. I want Africa. I've not been to Africa at all, and I want to see it.
All right. Well, let's get you here as soon as we can.
Let's do that. Everybody, take care, and thank you for having me. And cheers.
Thank you for your time, and to you and your family, stay safe and.
And you too.
Thank you. All right, so everyone, thank you so much. That was Mark Gillespie. We really appreciate his time. I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes. I'm going to have a quick look through the questions, see if there's anything else I can maybe answer. We have a question from Sebastian asking, are more recent vintages of Evan Williams single barrel available in South Africa? Hardy actually put a comment there saying he has the 2006. He bought a year or two back. Sebastian, it's not a standard kind of release in South Africa, so we seem to get them every few years. I think like Hardy, the last I saw was 2006 plus or minus. I think I may have seen a 2008, which probably would have been available in South Africa around 2017, 2018. So it's not a consistently available product, but it does come in batches. What's nice about it is that occasionally, we still find old ones available. So during normal business, kind of check our website and just give us a ring. If you look around, every now and again, you will find some of those older bottles. The truth is, they were absolute gems that, a lot of people didn't know what they were or, kind of give it the attention. So if you're lucky, you might still stumble across a bottle. We have, so Peter, I apologize. I didn't get to your question with Mark. Peter's question was, why is there such a massive price difference between whiskey in the USA and elsewhere? Peter, I can't answer that. I'm guessing at the moment, obviously, there's tariffs in place. I'm not going to attempt to kind of giving an answer there. I can't fully justify. I would imagine though, depending on the state you're in, there's obviously, because it's so decentralized, every state has its kind of own approach, and I know that kind of its own state taxes, and that makes it a little bit tricky. We have a question from Mitch. Is all American whiskey made from corn? Mitch, the answer is no. If you are making a bourbon whiskey, the requirement is in terms of the grains that you use, which they refer to as the mash bill, you have to use at least 51% corn. So if you're making a bourbon whiskey, it has to be at least 51% corn. But if you're making an American whiskey, there is no requirement. It does depend on the style you're making. So Americans can make single malt whiskey, and it would require them to use 100% malted barley. If they're making rye whiskey, then it needs to be at least 51% rye in the mash bill. But so to answer your question, no, all American whiskey is not necessarily made from corn. It depends on the style of whiskey they're making. And then another question from Mitch was, what are the best states to do a whistle stop tour in the USA? Mitch, sorry, I can't answer that. I lived in the US for a while, but in terms of whistle stop tour, I think it depends on, not a whiskey related question. So very kind of subjective in terms of, what you're interested in. Whether that's kind of, the craziness in New York or, Florida and the beaches in Miami or West Coast. So The question I did want to answer was from Richard saying, what are you guys tasting? We were drinking, and just happened, which was pretty cool, Evan Williams single barrel, and Mark had a bowl as well, slightly, same year, different barrel, and that's quite cool, and how we can kind of share that online. I planned to pour something else, but actually I don't know if you saw while we were live, I pulled the cork and the cork broke, so that's off to one side. I'll dig that cork up later. All right, I think that's plenty enough and bring us to a nice close. Just want to thank everyone for watching, all the great comments, and really appreciate it. We will, again, as soon as level 3 comes around and we can sell you some whiskey, we'll let you know. In the meantime, we'll keep doing this. So thank you very much again to Mark for tuning in. Thank you to everyone for your questions, for the participation, for the chat. I just cheers and Slan Javar. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy a good whiskey, and just kind of stay safe.